Hi everyone, this is lecture 9.1. This time we'll be talking about LGBT people and other victims of stigma. So first we'll talk about what social stigma is, then we'll talk a little bit about sexuality, and we will talk about defining sexualities. So first a note on stigma. So stigma or stigmatization is the process through which society decides that groups are undesirable, and this is generally perceived to be a negative phenomena. Sociologists don't study this thing because they like it, they study this thing because they want to understand it. And stigma is usually the basis for almost all types of discrimination in our society. Typically, a stigma is applied to all members of a stigmatized against group. So if black people are stigmatized in a certain way, all black people will kind of be treated in that way. If gay people are stigmatized in a certain way, if disabled people are stigmatized in a certain way, if former criminals or ex-cons are stigmatized in a certain way. We will be looking at LGBT people in this lecture, but mainly because they are one of the most heavily and historically stigmatized groups in modern America. Obviously, African Americans have been stigmatized via racism in the past. Women have been stigmatized with sexism. Various religious minorities have also been stigmatized in our society and other societies. But and I have taught whole classes on stigma, but for this lecture we'll be talking about it relating to LGBT people. But there are a lot of people who have been the victims of stigma. People who are overweight are the victims of stigma, right? We treat fat people we treat them badly, right? People with mental disorders face stigma. People who have been released from prison, as I mentioned, people with physical disabilities are also victims of stigma. So there are a lot of types of stigma in our society. Despite the fact that many of us are trying to get rid of these things, they do persist. So let's talk about sexuality then. And when we talk about sexuality, we have to define some terms. The first term I'll define is sexual orientation. And this isn't a perfect definition, but it will do for the moment. Sexual orientation is the inclination to be heterosexual, i.e. attracted to the opposite sex, homosexual, being attracted to the same sex, or bisexual, being attracted to either sex. There are subsexualities not included in this, but this is generally the thing we're talking about. Who you want to have sex with. That is your sexual orientation. The Kinsey Scale was one of the first early scale, not sociological, actually, biosocial or biological studies done. The Kinsey Scale discovered, Alfred Kinsey discovered, that human sexuality can be broken down into a 7-point scale. 0 being exclusively heterosexual, 6 being exclusively homosexual. And with there being 5 stages between what you could call absolutely heterosexual and 6 being called absolutely homosexual. It's a range of behavior. And most people that identify as being, and there's another interesting element to it here, most people that identify as being bisexual are probably not pure 3s, right? People who are bisexual, if you interview them, if you talk about them, usually don't report, I am absolutely 100% more attracted to men, equally attracted to men as I am to women, right? They don't usually say things like this. Like, yeah, I like girls, but I like guys more. They might say something like that, or vice versa. But also, and this is really interesting, people who identify as being gay might, in the right given set of circumstances, might find a lady or a guy that identifies as being gay, might find a lady that he finds attractive. Or similarly, a guy that identifies as being heterosexual, if he were a 1, would be predominantly heterosexual, but only incidental homosexuality. So maybe he might find a guy that he was attracted to one day. That is a possibility within this schema of understanding things. It's an interesting idea if you haven't really encountered this yet. And similarly, Kinsey found, and further research has backed up, that sexual orientation changes over the life course, or could change over the life course. That is a matter of debate in feminist communities, in social scientific communities, in sociological communities. How does that happen, right? Is that a matter of something that happens over years, right? That the individual becomes more and more attracted to people they hadn't been attracted to? Does it happen instantly, right? Could you wake up one morning and be of a different sexual orientation? Could you be, if you were straight, could you be gay tomorrow and then straight again the next day, right? That's not usually how we conceive of it as working, but theorists on the matter aren't entirely sure, which is social scientifically absolutely fascinating. Let's talk about defining sexualities then. There's a lot of vocabulary here, and we need to all be on the same page. Most people in our time are familiar with the acronym LGBT, but if you're not, it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Most people know now, in this year, that bisexual people are those who are attracted to both males and females, and transgender people are people who feel that their sex at birth does not match their sexual identity or how they feel in a gendered way. And, the trans rights movement has come a long way in recent years. But there are probably some letters you're not familiar with. If you are someone that's more than casually familiar with the LGBT community, you probably have seen more than just those letters. And I have a good friend that does a lot of LGBT activism. She calls this the alphabet soup. And it is very much a kind of a confusing thing. So you could see LGBT, and then after that you could see I, you could see A, you could see two A's, you could see P, Q, Q. The most common acronym is LGBTQ. Sometimes you see LGBT plus, or it's like plus whatever we want to add, right? But let's talk about those letters, those other letters. The I could be for intersex. These are people who are born with combinations of both parts. Combination of both sets of genitalia, for example. And this is a range of biological conditions. It's not just one thing. There are a lot of things that could cause someone to be born intersex. Asexual people are those people with, it's not entirely accurate to say no sexual feelings, but asexual people don't have sex drives the way most of us do, right? Most of us, in one time or another, in one form or another, feel driven by sex. Asexual people simply don't, or have a lesser drive to that degree. And that's not to say that asexual people don't like sex, that they never want to have sex, but they don't have that same drive that people that aren't asexual have, which is a very interesting thing to consider. Allies are heterosexual sympathizers and friends of the LGBT community. I consider myself to be a very staunch ally of the LGBT community. I hope most of you do too. Pansexual people are those who are attracted to personality, not necessarily body type. There is some discussion over what is the difference between being pansexual and being bisexual, right? And most of that has to refer to you're attracted to who a person is and their personality, not necessarily to their sex. Queer is generally a good catch-all to refer to anyone in the LGBT community. Sometimes the term queer is used to refer to the whole community, but like other words that have been taken back as being insults, right? And queer was once a slur against the LGBT community. If you don't feel comfortable using the word, don't use the word, right? Because you might be using it wrong. If you feel the need because of your identity to take ownership of that word, by all means do that, though. And the second Q is used to mean questioning, i.e. people who are questioning their sexuality. Most often you see that questioning Q in association with LGBT youth groups, right, that want to let people who are questioning their sexuality, young people, to be able to come to events, or maybe just to be more welcoming to everyone at the event, especially with populations that have a heavy that have a heavy population of people who think they might be gay but aren't necessarily sure, right? And usually you have that with young people, because quite frankly, when I was a teenager, I didn't have everything figured out, and I'm sure it has to be very confusing for not straight teens. I mean, obviously, right? There are some more commonly confused terms, especially since what it means to be transgender has changed dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. A transgender person is a person who feels that their gender does not fit with social norms imposed on them. A transgender person may be heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, asexual, any sexuality. So a transgender person could be be different sexuality wise than everyone else, right? So you have a transgender woman who was born a male, and then that transgender woman is attracted to males, then that would make that person a transgender female who is heterosexual, right? If you're not really familiar with this stuff, it can be quite confusing. The term transsexual was once used to refer to a person that feels the need to seek some sort of gender reassignment. Many transgender people do feel the need to have some sort of gender reassignment surgery or hormone replacement or something like that. But that not all transgender people do, right? And that is largely seen as being a level of individual choice. And because that's individual choice, because trans people are kind of sick of talking to non-trans people about what their genitals look like right now, right? The term has become obsolete. So really the conversations around trans people are less about now what their genitals look like and more like who they are as people. And that has been a large step in the trans community in the last 5 years. And as of 2016, it's been a bit since I've updated this, but it's important. We're seeing a transition from the term transgender to just trans to talk about transgender people. It might be in 10 years that the term transgender becomes obsolete and could be considered insulting, right? All of these things. Language is dynamic, right? The words that were used in 1960 to talk about black people, if you would call a black person a Negro today, right? That would be likely deeply insulting. But in 1960, that was the polite thing to call somebody, right? Words change over time, and words absolutely do matter. But there are more words referring to trans people. When we talk about transition or the transition, that's when a person, if they choose to change their physical parts, does that. People that undergo the transition could do hormones, they could do surgery, they do a social transition. They say, okay, my name's Jeremy, but please call me Jenny from now on. There's a social element to it. They could do all of those things. They could do a combination of those things. Many trans people opt to do social transition and hormones. Others go the whole way with the surgery. They do all or a combination of those things because the surgery is not without complications, and many trans people don't feel the need to have that surgery, and it is also very expensive. We once talked more, when we talked more about being transsexual, we often talked about trans people being MTF, being male to female, or being FTM, female to male. Again, we don't use those terms as much as we used to because we don't really talk about transsexuality as much as we used to. And this is just how the movement is adapting and changing over time. And when I did update this presentation in 2016, I have to redo this presentation every couple years. Because it changes so rapidly. Every once in a while, I go into a classroom and I've asked a question about a new thing, and I go, uh-oh, I have to update my presentation again. So when I did it in 2016, I had to include non-binary people. So these are people that feel that their gender identity cannot be placed either in a male or female category, right? So the non-binary category is especially, and cisgender, well, that's a different thing. Non-binary category or gender fluid category is newer. So more young people or younger people identify as being non-binary than, say, a LGBT person in their 50s, for example. So it's a person that doesn't want to be put in male or female categories. A lot of non-binary people prefer to go by the term they instead of by he or she. And they feel that they don't want to be held into those constraints of gender. They feel better not being done that way. Cisgender people, then, are individuals who feel that their gender identity matches the sex that they were born with. So most of us are cisgender. I am a cisgender male, right? Heterosexual male. This is not an insulting term, but we have to have this term cisgender to talk about transgender people, because if we don't have a word for people who aren't trans other than not trans, then the inclination is to call trans people different, right? To call them weird, to call them not ordinary. If we just call people who aren't trans normal, then that makes trans people others, right? And that creates stigma, and that holds stigma. If you want to talk about trans people, then we need this term cisgender to talk about people whose gender identity is consistent, that's what the cis is, right? Consistent with the gender that they were born with. It's not an insulting term. It got some weird, when people first started using it more openly, it got some weird use on the internet. So some people sometimes still think that cisgender is an insulting term. It shouldn't be. It's not an insulting term. I'm a cisgender male, but that's what that's about. So if you have any questions on this stuff, this is really confusing stuff if you're not really familiar with it. Please let me know, and we will be discussing this online. See you later.